Hey, how's it going, everybody? Hope you all enjoyed the introduction to Python module that we had last week, where we kind of got started with variables and the different structures of data that you're actually going to see in Python. Some simple functions such as print, input, and things like that. In this module, we're going to be going a little bit deeper and really covering what object-oriented programming is and kind of just the different parts of Python or some of the different theories in Python that are used, which actually make it a object-oriented programming language. It's a scripting language as well, and there's other object-oriented programming languages out there, but hopefully after this lesson you'll have a better idea of what object-oriented programming is and why it is so useful. So this is going to be object-oriented programming. Our objectives for this module are going to be to go over an overview of Python functions, which are just a way to create reusable blocks of code, how we pass data into those functions in things called arguments. We're going to look at the different global versus local variable rules, because when we are using variables within a function, there are some rules that we have to keep in mind where some variables are not going to be accessible from outside of that function unless we actually return them back to the core global code, if you will, or the core program. We're going to be covering Python classes and then how to create methods within those classes. And classes and methods are really that's kind of where we're now getting into object-oriented programming. And then we're going to be covering object-oriented programming fundamentals. I found some things on the internet that I think really help kind of describe object-oriented programming and why we use it. All right, so an overview of this lecture is we're going to be defining some functions and going over the theory behind defining functions. We'll look at the different ways we can pass in variables, arguments, lists, or different data types into functions. We'll be looking at the difference between global versus local variables as it does relate to accessing variables either within or outside of our function. We'll be covering Python classes, and we'll actually be building some classes which are used to describe objects. And then class methods, which are basically just functions that are built in or a member of that class. So they're kind of a child to that class. So the method really needs to apply in some way, shape, or form to the class object that we are actually defining. And then we'll look at object-oriented programming and how all these classes, functions, and methods work together to create a full object-oriented programming base. We'll look at different class and instance variables and how every time we create a new instance of that class, how we can have different variables for each instance. We'll go under class inheritance, where we don't need to exactly define every single thing about a class if it is related to another class, where we can just inherit the values that we defined in the parent class. Finally, I'll be going into a little bit of demo on the SDN VM, where we will be covering making some functions, classes, methods, and importing statements, and we'll actually get to see this stuff in action. And then finally, we'll move into the summary. Okay, so defining functions. So what a function is it's a block of code that you give a name, and you can just reuse that block of code wherever you need to. So if you find yourself actually writing the same code over and over, perhaps a while loop or a for loop, and you seem to be using that while or for loop over and over, you can simply just define it in a function and then call the function instead of continuously writing that loop over and over. There are a couple naming rules. The syntax for defining a function is that little def space the function name followed by open and close parentheses, and then it needs to end with a colon as well. Naming rules, it can't start with a number. It can't be a Python reserved word. There's a few of them that are actually in Python, so you cannot use something that would, start to confuse Python because it's already used elsewhere as a built-in reserved word. It can be any combination of upper, lowercase characters, numbers, underscores, or dashes. Arguments. So when we're defining a function, we're defining a block of code that needs to be used more than once. So arguments would be things that you are actually passing into that function. A function does not have to accept arguments, but usually that is the whole purpose of you creating the function. So when we pass in arguments, we've got different ways that we can do it, because now you're at that level where you see, we've got different things like lists, dictionaries, which are key value pairs, variables by themselves. So there's different ways to pass in all these data types into our function depending on what it is that we actually wrote the function to do. So we can pass in multiple arguments, and then we've got these things called arbitrary arguments. And arbitrary is like, we don't know how many of those arguments are actually going to be passed into the function. Could be 5, could be 100. And in order to tell Python that we may be getting more than one of these arguments, but it's going to be used in the same place within that function, we define it with a single asterisk. For key value, otherwise known as keyword arguments, we use a double asterisk. And all that is, it's very similar to how we've been defining, let's say, elements of a dictionary where we use key value pairs. It's a very similar thing where we have a key and then we assign it a very specific value. And then there's also some cool tips and tricks that you can use inside of key value arguments, not only by using a double asterisk to say, hey, I want to accept as many of these as I can, but you can also do things like default values or make them an optional argument that needs to be passed in. You can pass in lists, and then when we're unpacking arguments with the asterisks, what we're doing is Python creates a tuple and adds all the arguments that you passed into that single tuple, and then that tuple is then passed into the function itself. All right, global versus local variables. If I define a function and I define a variable outside of that function, which you'll see from just the indentation rules that apply to functions, I cannot access a variable that is outside of that function. But what I can do is pass in a variable or a value as an argument to the function. That goes in reverse order as well. If I create or define a variable from within my function, it is not accessible to the core code outside of that function unless I use something called a return statement, in which I am returning that value as an output of the function. We've got the pass statement, which you can use as a means to keep your code from erroring out. It's basically just kind of like a continue, and that's mostly, I believe that is how it's defined in your book, is, this can be used to keep your code from erroring out and continue to run. If you assign a variable, there I kind of hit on that already. Assigning a variable within the function, you need to use that return statement in order for it to be accessible from outside of that function. But you can also make that return value, you can assign a variable the name of the function with the arguments passed in. That way you just have that variable, and the value of that variable is going to be the output of the function. And we will be seeing that also in the demo. Classes. What classes are is they're meant to describe objects, and this is where we're really getting into that object-oriented programming. So what is an object as it relates to object-oriented programming? An object is meant to represent something in the real world, an object in the real world. So it could be a cell phone, a car, a person, an animal, just something in the real world, and the class is used to represent that object in software or in code. Standard is that they always start with capital letters, and the syntax to create your class is going to be class and then the name of the object followed by a colon. And then you usually create comments with triple quotes in there. There's different ways you can comment things out in Python. Triple quotes kind of allows you to make a comment like a sectioned comment, because you can do a bigger comment that way, whereas like if you used the pound symbol, that would be like just to comment out that line or that word. But we usually add some comments underneath the class that say, what it is that class is actually representing. We have to initialize the class using the init method, and the init method is kind of like how it's said, it initializes it, and there's a lot of theory around that method. I just don't want to get stuck on it, but because you'll commonly see if you get some like freeware, some free programs from GitHub or something, that it'll say the app always starts with like if init equals main or if name equals main, and that's just going back to that init function where it initializes the actual object and then all of the attributes. So what are class attributes? Class attributes are the items that you build into the class that actually describe that real world object. So for instance, a car, it could have an attribute of color, make, model, size, how many doors. It's something that is describing that object, and that's what those attributes are. And then we can access those attributes from anywhere in our code after we make an initialization or an instance of that class. So I could have car1 with different attributes than car2, but they are all using the same class. And hopefully, if you're not picking up on that, hopefully when we actually get into the coding demo section of it, that it really starts to make sense as we kind of build out some of our own classes and attributes. All right, class methods. What a method is it is simply a function that is built into the class. So the function itself needs to kind of relate to that object. So I just used the analogy car, so you could say like get fuel or get mileage. That is a function that it would actually be related to the class car. So they are declared in the class itself. They are a member of the class, but you define them the exact same way you would any other function. And then when you initialize that class, the methods that are a member of that class become available as soon as you create your first instance of the class. You can call methods from the main code. You can use the import statement to import your classes, and that's where we're getting into creating different modules. It's very common to create a file called models.py where you keep all of your classes for your program. So you would have models.py, and then you would have all of your classes defined in that file, in that .py file, and then from your core code, you would just say import model and then the name of the class, or you could import the whole module, and we'll be going over some of examples of that. But I do have a little example statement down there, and that's from models import class name. And models is just kind of the standard used for the document or the file, the Python file that holds all of your classes and the methods, any child classes that you want, because we're going to be also working with inheritance, where I can create a new class that inherits all of its values from a parent class, including any methods that are a member of that class. And here we're starting to, now we're looking at object-oriented programming. So we can import different modules. What is a module? A module is simply a file, a Python file, that contains, for example, our classes. You could also have a module that contains all of your functions that you use for your code, and it just makes the code easier to read because it stores all of your structured information in a completely separate file, and that way you can just import it and you don't have to have like a single file that has all of your classes, functions, methods, and the actual core code itself all on the same file, just because it gets a little confusing when you're taking a look at it. So I could also say, from class import a specific object, or from class import a specific object. Each instance of the class is another object. So if I had 2 cars, that would be 2 separate objects because they would be representing 2 separate cars and more than likely would have very different attributes, things describing that object. And initialization allows Python to see anything that's local. So what does that mean? When I'm talking about these models.py and these modules, is when I start my code or when I initialize even, let's say, the Python interpreter, so I go ahead and start a Python interpreter. I have now initialized Python, and Python can see everything that is in the same directory. So as long as that models.py file lives in the same directory as wherever I started to initialize that Python interpreter at, it will see all the Python files that are in there, and that's how I can use them to import the entire module or specific classes, objects out of that module. This allows us to keep smaller blocks of code and reuse that code. Makes for better code standard and readability. So I do believe, although the code gets more complicated as we start to define functions, classes, and modules, it does make it a little easier to understand when you've broken that code up into a bunch of little pieces, and then you only have to work on those specific pieces. If something breaks, you would only have to make that correction in, that in specific module. And this is really where programming is going. It used to be like one big block of code where it was one giant program, and we're just not doing that anymore. We've started to break things up into smaller pieces and just reuse a lot of those pieces. All right, so object-oriented programming continued. Covered a little bit of class and instance variables. So your class variables are going to be defined within the class, but each instance of that class that you initialize, that goes back to that car 1 and car 2 that would have different attributes describing the individual cars. The methods, you can have you kind of need return values on those because they follow the same rules as functions. So anything done within that method, those variables are not accessible outside of that method unless you use the return statement. You can update class attributes, you can add more class attributes, and each instance of the class is its own object. Inheritance. I've touched on this briefly, so we can create another class that inherits all of the attributes from a parent class, all of the methods from a parent class, and then we're creating that child class for a reason, but then if it's so closely related, we can create methods that would be only specific to that child class, and we'll be covering examples of that in the demo. You can add to, but you can't take away from the parent class, so you can't remove a method if you are inheriting, if you create a child class that's inheriting all of its value, its attributes and methods from a parent class, you cannot take those away because they are already initialized in the parent class. You can alter, and this again allows for better reuse of code, and by reuse of code, I mean we don't have to completely rewrite that code again. We are just referencing something that we have already written. All right, so in summary, we've gone over defining functions, the different argument types and how we can pass those arguments into our functions, the difference between global and local variables, how we have to use that return statement in order to access any type of return value as a result of that function. We've covered different classes and the class methods. We've covered a little bit about, creating some child classes, and we've gotten into Batman and creating our characters in Batman, as well as creating some different methods for those classes. We've covered object-oriented programming, what it is, and I hope you now have a better understanding of what it means to be an object in object-oriented programming and how that really that's really some of those core elements or core theories is those classes, the class methods that are used to describe those objects or interact with those objects. We've gone over class and instance variables, how each instance of that class can have its own variables. And then we've covered class inheritance, and finally we went into a demo of functions, classes, methods, object-oriented programming, importing from modules, and the use of aliases. All right, so if there's any questions, I do recommend and ask that you direct them, please, towards the discussion board. Chances are if you have that question, somebody else also in the class has that question, and it just helps to start to debate amongst your peers. It's something that's very important that you learn how to do once you get into the real world, is debate, and debate healthfully about good ways to do things, better ways of doing things, and just that's how you come up with the best solution for everything. So with that, I will leave you to the labs. I hope you enjoy the labs for this week. And next week, we will be diving in a little bit further with Python and working with different data in Python, as well as some of the modules that are pre-built and ready for networking and software-defined networking. So I hope you enjoy this week's labs. Thank you. Okay, so I am on the SDN VM. I'm going to go ahead and clear my screen here and just kind of, I like to always just kind of do a little quick check to see where I'm at and what I'm working with. So I'll usually do a quick list and make sure I'm in the correct directory that I want to be working at. So I'm going to go ahead and do a Git Clone to clone down my repository of example. To clone down my repository that includes the SDN demo with all the samples. So I'm going to log in to my GitHub. And I have just pulled down the repository. Okay, good. And I'll go into the SDN demo, do a nice little git status for good measure, and see that, all right, sweet, I'm on the main branch, and I am up to date with my remote repo, which makes sense because I just downloaded it. All right, so I'm going to go into module 3 here, and I've got a couple of different ones pulled up, so I will go ahead and swap over to some of my demo code here. And we'll just focus on the first example for right now. So in the first example, I am defining the function named hello world. You can see that I've defined it with this def statement. The name of my function is hello world. I am not passing any arguments into it, so there's nothing in my parentheses. I end the function, and then all my function is doing is a print hello world. You'll notice that there is an indentation right here as well. That's because after you define it, you have to make sure that you indent one, otherwise Python does not know that it is actually still in that function, or that it's a part of that function. And then down here, I'm just going to go ahead and run the function. So let me go back to demo. I'm just going to go ahead and paste my function in. Whoops, it probably would help if I'm in Python, right? So I'll go into Python 3. So there you can see I've defined my function, and now I'm just going to simply call my function hello world with the parentheses, and you can see my function went ahead and executed just as I thought it would. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and do a quick example of one where we have to pass in arguments. We'll take a look real quick here. And now we're on this example. And for this lecture, I've chose to keep a theme of just kind of different Batman characters. So here you can see I am defining the function named show character, but this one I'm actually requiring that an argument be passed into it, and that argument is character. And all I'm going to do is print the argument. So down here I will be defining the Batman character as Batman, and then running my function, passing in this variable, but as the function reads it, it is going to read it as character. So no matter what I passed in, if I passed in a single variable, no matter what, it's still going to print that variable. That's why we keep it the same within a function. But I am passing in the variable Batman character. So let's go ahead and see that one work. Oops, did I close security? Nope, there it is. All right, so now I'll do that, and I'll define my Batman character. And let's go ahead and run my function, passing in my Batman character. And there you can see it simply just printed out character. But this would work with anything, so Python doesn't know whether or not this is a Batman character. So I could do x equals FSCJ. And I could still do a show character x, and you can see my function still operates as I designed it to. I can also pass in lists. So let's see what happens if I pass in a list to my function that does a print character. So that's Batman characters, and my other one is Batman characters. So I'm just going to do an up real quick and add the S in there. So let's see what happens here. So there it simply printed out the entire list, but that's not really what it is that I'm looking for. So I'm going to make an adjustment to this function because what I'm expecting is it to kind of loop through that list and then print out each individual characters. Here it just simply printed the list to the screen. So the one we're going to be using for our list up here is going to be this show characters function right here, where I have also nested a for loop, and it's for C in CHR, which CHR is what we're passing into the function. So for C in CHR, print C. And then we'll go ahead and run that function. Paste my function in here. Okay, cool. And then I've already got my list there, so I'll just go ahead and enter in show characters Batman characters. Let's see if it executes. All right, it did. So it just went ahead and ran that for loop against the list that I passed into my function. All right, sorry about that. I'm back. Phone went off, so I had to step away for just a moment. So I'll just go ahead and pick back up as we were starting to get into returning values from the output of our function. And this is where we start to see that global and local variable theory that we were talking about. So here you can see I'm defining a few different functions: get name, ability, role, and alias. Inside of the function, I'm declaring the variable name and then assigning it a value of character, which is going to be the argument that's passed into my function. And it's looking for the key name to assign to the variable name. And then it's going to return name when this function is executed. Same goes with the get ability, get role, alias, and then I've created down here a couple different dictionaries for Batman characters, and then I've given each one of them different abilities, role, alias, and name, and assigned them all to character 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So I will go ahead and paste in my functions. And I'll paste in my characters. And then I'll do a get name on character 1, and there you can see it returns my character's name. It returns it from that return statement, return name. But where we start to get into that global and local variable theory is if I go print name, you can see it errors out and it says name is not defined. Although it is defined up here inside of my function, name equals character name. But since that is local to the function, I can only get the return value from the return statement, and I cannot call that variable from outside of the function. And you'll notice that it printed it to the screen, but up here in my functions, I don't have a print statement. That is because we just executed the function and it is returning just the value that we are asking for. So if I go get role for character 2, I can see it's a hero, but I don't have that stored anywhere yet. So what I can do is do character 2 role equals the name of the function, passing in the argument character 2, and then I can print character 2 role, and that makes it so that we can actually work with the data that was produced from the output of our function. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next one. And the next one that we're going to be doing is going to be passing in multiple arguments. So down here, this is going to be the one that we're working with. And I'll keep it here for right now because we'll just focus on this one. So this would be a ordered argument example where I'm defining my function get character, and then I'm passing in name, alias, role, and abilities. Here I've included a quick little description of what the function is doing that is annotated by the 3 quotes, start and close. So Python is going to read that as a comment block. And then all I'm doing with this function is printing that F is for format, and it's a just some formatted text that says this character is called, and then I'm calling the alias argument that we're passing in, and then I added on the title method right there, which just capitalizes it, because realistically, as you create different lists or objects, things in Python, you're really not going to be worried about the case too much as far as the values are concerned, because you can just use some of Python's built-in methods to do your casing for you. So it's going to say the character is called, and it's going to print out their alias, also passed into the title method, which should capitalize it. Print their real name is, and then name, which is another argument that we are passing in, also going through the title method, which should capitalize it. And then finally, I'm printing formatted alias.title has the special ability of abilities, which is yet another argument that we are passing in. Down here, I've got character 1 defined as Bruce Wayne, Batman, hero, and master detective, and we'll be going over running the function while passing in character 1, and then how we're doing it down here as an ordered pair, but these have to be in the same order. So name is here, alias, Batman, role, hero, abilities, master detective. If I moved these around, the function will execute in the order at which I pass in my arguments. So let's take a look at that. paste in my function. And then my Batman character. And we'll see what happens when I try and pass in my character, because what I'm passing in right now essentially is a tuple indicated by the parentheses, character1, into my function getCharacter. Although everything is there, I am passing in just the character, so I'm passing in a single tuple, not everything. So when I run this, you can see it errors out and it says getCharacter missing 3 required positional arguments, alias, role, and abilities, because it saw character1 just as the name argument. But what I can do is do getCharacter and then pass in all of my arguments in order just like that. So when I run my getCharacter, passing in Bruce Wayne, Batman, Hero, and Master Detective, you can see my function executes as designed. It says this character is called Batman, their real name is Bruce Wayne, and Batman has a special ability, Master Detective. Just as another quick example, here's one for Catwoman, whose real name is Selina Kyle. She's a villain and an expert burglar. And then the character is called Catwoman, their real name is Selina Kyle, and Catwoman has the special ability of expert burglar. So my function seems to be working just fine. Now we've got another way to pass in arguments, which is the keywords that we were talking about earlier. So the difference between passing in arguments normally compared to keywords is going to be, here's passing in just a single argument. So it is accepting whatever I passed in. It actually accepted this, but because I didn't have multiple characters to pass in, I didn't pass in enough arguments, that's why it errored out. But then we can also use these key value or keyword arguments. So here I am specifically saying name is equal to, and then I gave it a default value of unknown. So if it doesn't receive that argument passed into it, it will automatically assign it the value of unknown. And then I did alias, role, and abilities. However, my keyword argument is at the front, and where it really needs to be is at the back. Because these are ordered pairs, it's going to look for this one first, second, third, and then you can define your keyword arguments just as you would, for example, a variable. And then it's executing the same code, or it's doing the same thing as our getCharacter did in the past, but this time we're just using a single keyword argument mixed with a ordered pair argument. And then over here I actually corrected it, so we'll run it once with everything working like this and just kind of see how the output is and how it's not what we're expecting and what we're wanting. And then I actually did it correctly where I defined getCharacter again. Then I had argument 1, 2, 3, and then finally my keyword argument. But the function is still going to execute the same. Now down here you can see we'll be passing in, Batman, Hero, Master Detective, we'll be passing everything back in. But at the bottom, I've got Batman, Hero, Master Detective, and then I defined name equals Bruce Wayne. I thought Bane was a good one to use to demonstrate the use of a default value. So I will not be passing in a keyword argument for Bane because he does not have a name. His name is still unknown. He's just goes by his alias, which is Bane. So by not passing this in, we will see that it still uses that default value that we pass into it. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so I will go ahead and we'll start with the keyword argument that is out of place. And look, it doesn't even let me define it. It tells me right there, syntax error, non-default argument follows default argument. So non-default argument is things like alias, role, and abilities follows a default argument, which I set a default to name of unknown. But it doesn't even let me define it because it yells at me and says, hey, you can't do that. So we'll throw it in here as corrected. And that one seems to have taken just fine. So let's go ahead and run that against the original that we have here, which here I'm saying get character, run the get character function, pass in Batman as the alias, hero is the role, abilities is master detective, and finally Bruce Wayne is the name, but I'm not defining actually name equals Bruce Wayne. And let's see what the output of my function is, because it should tell me on the second line there, print formatted, their real name is, and then name.title. I'm passing it through the title method. And one thing I do want to cover real quick, because I forgot to cover it, is the use of these little curly brackets right here. Now what those curly brackets are is you'll notice that my print statement contains double quotes. So if I didn't put those curly brackets around alias.title, which is one of my arguments passed into the title method, without those curly brackets, it would simply print out alias.title as a string. So this allows me, these curly brackets, to grab my argument that I passed in and also run it through the title method. So let's see what happens if I don't actually specify name equals Bruce Wayne. It works just fine. The character is called Batman. Their real name is Bruce Wayne. Batman has a special ability as a master detective. I'll go ahead and run that for Catwoman just for good measure. And there, everything looks okay, sweet. But let's go ahead and throw in Bane, who we will not be passing in the fourth argument, so we're not going to get... We've seen already that if you are missing an argument, it will error out at you and say, hey, you know, you only passed in one argument and I was expecting this many arguments. Well, here I'm only passing in 3 arguments, but because my keyword argument has a default value of unknown, it is optional. And if I don't pass in anything, it will just use the default value. So let's go ahead and run this function against Bane. And there it says this character is called Bane. Their real name is unknown, and Bane has the special ability of peak human physical condition. Now, when using keyword arguments like this, it is more of a best practice, although, you know, passing in Bruce Wayne and Selena Kyle without name worked. If there's a default value, it's kind of just to declare it when you're passing it in. So now I'm going to pass in name equals Bruce Wayne as my keyword argument, and we'll see what we get out of that. And there you can see it executed the same, but it just makes it a little bit more readable when I actually go take a look at that function and see that there's a default value for name. Now I know why I am explicitly calling out name equals Bruce Wayne. Okay, and fine. I'm going to do another one here, but this time I am going to also run a function, and I'm going to do an if statement in there. So this one is another one of those optional kind of parameters that we're working with. So we're doing define get character, alias, role, abilities, name as a default value of unknown. But then at the very bottom, you can see that I defined if role, so that's saying if role exists, you know, if it's true, if it's there, then print formatted, they are considered a, and then print the role argument that we passed into it. So let's go ahead and try and run our function against Catwoman as expert burglar, and you'll see we did not put a role in for Catwoman. Let's see if it executes the way we think it's going to. It does not. It says I'm missing one required positional argument. But here I'm adding in this if statement, so it's not really required within the function. So what we can do for that is assign it a keyword argument with a default value of nothing, which makes it optional. So let's go ahead and run that one again against Catwoman. And you'll notice I'm not passing in Catwoman's role as a villain. So the character is called Catwoman. Their real name is Selena Kyle. Catwoman has a special ability, Expert Burglar, but it did not execute the if statement because role was not defined for Catwoman. So let's go ahead and run this for Bane, where we do define a role for Bane. And let's see if our function actually prints out that string for they are considered a, and there it does. They are considered a villain. So it took and ran that if statement because role actually existed for that argument. And again, we can do another one for good measure real quick, and we'll just do we'll do one for Batman, and then they are considered a hero. Great. I'm gonna go ahead and quit this real quick and clear my terminal. So now let's take a look at passing in some arbitrary arguments. And if you remember from the lecture that the arbitrary arguments are when we want to pass in arguments to our function, but we don't know how many of those that we want to pass in. So I'm going to demonstrate that with these functions right here. Here we go. Where I'm still doing my get character, and I'm going to pass in the alias as my first argument, which is not arbitrary. It does not have the asterisk symbol, as you see right there. But the abilities, I am. So I'm going to pass in as many abilities as I want. So I'll pass in just the alias of Batman, and then the abilities of Master Detective, Genius Level Intellect, Master Escapologist, and Master Martial Artist. And then I'm going to adjust that. You know what? Let's go ahead and run it first as is, and then we'll come back and take a look at that. All right, so if I go ahead and get back into Python, I'll define my function. And then we will go ahead and pass in all of our arguments for Batman and see what is returned back. The character is called Batman, and then it says, Batman is the special ability of Master Detective, Genius Level Intellect, Master Escapologist, and Master Martial Artist. If you remember in the slide, I said that when we do arbitrary arguments, that Python creates a tuple and then stores each one of the values that we pass in, because it could be as many as we want, into that tuple. So what just happened here is we passed in the alias of Batman, which took the place of that argument, and then multiple ability arguments, and with the asterisks, Python took each one of these values and created a tuple filled with all of those values that we passed in, because it's arbitrary. It can take as many as we pass into it. But this really does not look like what I wanted to display to the screen. So I'll go ahead and delete this one. And let's go back to GitHub. And we'll look at the change that we're going to make to this function to make it execute more in the way that we are trying to get it to do. So you see, you kind of got to mess with your code and play with your code a little bit in order to actually get what you want it to do. But here we're going to accept the same arguments, alias and abilities. We're going to make abilities arbitrary, and then print formatted, the character is called, alias passed into the title method inside of my curly brackets so that it does not print out what is actually in the double quotes exactly. And then I'm going to print formatted alias.title has the special abilities, and then I ended that print statement and I started a for loop. So I'll do for ability in abilities, which is going to then loop through each item in the tuple and print formatted the ability.title. And then we will run that function against our Batman character again. So let's go ahead and run that and see what it looks like. So I'll paste in my function. Now I'll pass in my arguments for my Batman character and see what is returned back. That looks much better, looks like much better in kind of what we more wanted the code to do. So the character is called Batman, and Batman has the special abilities of formatted out, master detective, genius level intellect, escapologist, and master martial artist. All right, so our last arguments that we have to take a look at is going to be the arbitrary keyword arguments. So we'll come back over here. And this is what we're going to be using as example code for that. So I'm going to define the function build character. It's going to accept alias and then character info. You'll commonly see for functions that accept arbitrary keyword arguments to have the statement key w-args right there. Just the same goes for arbitrary arguments. You would typically have the asterisk followed by just args. It's just kind of a formatting standard that a lot of people choose to go with, but it is not required. We can define it in any way we want. So to make it easier just for readability and for learning purposes, I'm going to keep it at the quargs, or arbitrary keyword arguments, as character info. And then this one's a little bit different. It says builds a dictionary with the information of the character, because I'm passing in key value pairs. So here I've got character info alias equals alias, which is going to be the first argument we pass in, and this starts building the dictionary. And then I will also return character info. So let's see what happens when I pass in build character for Batman, name of Bruce Wayne, role of villain, ability, and affiliation. You'll notice that for each one of these, I defined the key and the value as an argument that I'm passing into the function. I'm going to delete that screenshot. Go over here, and I will paste in my function, and let's go ahead and build Batman. So build character Batman, and then with the different keyword arguments that I'm sending in as arbitrary keyword args. So it took it, and you can see it printed that to the screen. I'll do the same for Joker. I'll build the character Joker. Oh, I didn't like that one. That's because apparently I had it misspelled in my code. So let me just add that A back in there. Let's go ahead and... All right, there it worked. I was just missing an A in build character, so it wasn't seeing the function. But there you can see it returned a dictionary, name, Jack Napier, role, villain. Name is disputed. You know, that depends on which version or which Batman universe it is that we're talking about. But again, you know, we just ran the function in the Python interpreter, so we haven't actually done anything. And this one I kind of tried to make, you know, like the function name actually like what it is that we're trying to do. So here we're trying to build a character based on the alias that we pass in, and then any other keyword arguments that we would like to pass in for that character. So we are building a character. In order to use that later, what we can do is do character1 equals build character. And then I will just go ahead, actually, let me just go ahead and copy and paste, because that'll be easier. And it's picking up on my close parenthesis. All right. But there I'm doing character1, build character, Batman, name Bruce Wayne, and all of his keyword arguments. And now if I print character1, you can see it printed my dictionary to the screen. Same thing goes, I'll do one more example for Joker. And print character 2. And there you can see it printed to the screen. I can even verify with type. So do type character 2. It is reading it as a dictionary. So now we have built this character as a dictionary, and we can interact with it the same we would any other dictionary. So I'll do ability, print character, ability. And there you can see it printed my character's ability. Okay, so the next one is starting to get into this, this concept of importing. So when it comes to importing, when we start the Python interpreter, we're initializing an instance of Python. So here you can see I've changed directories and I'm listed, and I've got this characters.py file, which ends in a .py extension, and in there I have defined two functions, getCharacter and buildCharacter, same ones we've been using before. And when I initialize Python in the Python interpreter, what's happening is Python can actually read anything that's in the same directory or a child directory below it from where I actually initialize Python, you know, based on where I'm at actually in my path. So right now I'm in the module 3 directory. If I get into the Python interpreter, then I have initialized an instance of Python, and it will see all these .py files, and it will allow me to import them as modules. So that's what my characters.py is it's the characters module, and inside that module I have getCharacter and buildCharacter. So when I get inside of Python here, and clear my screen and start up Python 3, now I'm in the interpreter. So I've initialized Python, and it can see everything that is in that directory and it below it. So here you can see I've entered the import characters command, which imports the entire characters module with one simple import statement. I don't need to add the .py extension. So there you can see I'm calling characters.getCharacter, the name of the function, and then I'm passing in the same values that I have before. You know, we're sticking with Batman for one argument, and then the rest is arbitrary, so it can take as many as it wants after that. So when I go ahead and execute this, you can see that it executes as we expected and prints out our function executes. And we did that just by using the import. We didn't need to define the function again because we imported that entire module. Now right here, though, we're still just running that function, and it's printing out some stuff to the screen. The build characters function, if you recall, you know, that actually kind of performs a task for us. So it allows us to store the value as a variable. So here because that's the whole point of the function, was to build out this dictionary of the character. So here you can see I'm creating character 1, and I'm assigning it the value characters, build character, where I'm passing through Batman and all of its keyword attributes. So when I run it, if I print character 1, you can see it prints out the dictionary that was the output of the build character function. And now we're going to take a look at what happens if I do an import, but I can also use this concept of aliases, where I can import a module but assign it a different value, either in my main code or, as we're going to see in this example, directly in the Python interpreter. So I'm going to import that characters module again, but this time, instead of just importing characters, I'm going to import it as C, which will still reference that characters module. And it just allows us to not have to run the entire characters dot whatever the name of the function is, and then pass it into our actual, and then pass it into the interpreter. I can just do this C dot and then the name of the function. And here you can see we're passing in Batman and then all of the abilities because this is our arbitrary function. And if I run it, it works just fine because it still read that C alias that I assigned to the characters element, or I mean the characters module. It still referenced that as C in the code, and then it referenced that module and executed the function that actually exists in that module. Okay, so I'm going to quit out of here right now, clear my screen. We can also import, from the module, we can import the function directly by using this from statement. So I'm going to use from characters, which is the module that the function is located in, import, and then the name of the function, and there you can see it took. Now I do not need to add the characters before actually using the function because I have imported not just the module, but the function directly. So here I'm going to go ahead and just call it with get character, pass it in our Batman character with all of the Batman's abilities, and there you can see the function executed without having to actually put in the characters as well. We can also use our build characters and call out, import our build characters directly from the module. So here I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it as an alias, and I'm going to say just build. So then I'm going to use build, and I'm going to pass in, create this dictionary, variable dictionary character1, and its value is going to be the build function, and I'm just going to go ahead and pass it in our Batman character, and it should return back the dictionary for which was the output of build character. So if I print character1, you can see that I now have a dictionary with Batman and all of the different key value pairs, keyword arguments that we passed into that function. All right, so now we're going to start taking a look at classes. And what classes are a way for us to describe an object. So this is really where we're starting to get into that object-oriented programming aspect of the course. So I'm going to get into my repository here and take a look at my demo code, and we'll be just initializing this one directly in the interpreter. So we're going to take a look at this class of this character class that we're going to be creating. So I'll just go ahead and zoom in on this information. Okay, so here you can see that I'm defining the class with the syntax class followed by the name of the class character, starting with an uppercase letter because that's how you should define your classes, parentheses, and then a colon. And then I have a little description on the class. It's class of Batman characters. And then we're defining a function that starts with a init. And what that does is it initializes the instance of that class. And the first argument that we're passing into this function is self, which is going to be whatever value we define for the name of this instance of the class or the name of this object. And then we've got these other arguments that we're passing in, name, alias, role, which are all going to be attributes of the object, things that describe the object. So we're going to make 4 different instances of this object character, and then we're going to assign it that these attributes, self.name equals name, self.alias equals alias, self.role equals role, and abilities equals abilities. So what we're doing here is passing in those arguments at the bottom where we're defining character 1, 2, 3, 4. That is what's going to be that self portion of it. So character 1 self is going to then reference the arguments that we pass in when we initialize that instance of this object. So self.name for character 1 would be character1.name, and that would then give me back that attribute as it relates to this object. And this is the most basic form of actually creating a class and an object with object-oriented programming, and then we're going to be able to access these attributes and do things with them in other places in our program by referencing the self, which is the name of the object, dot the attribute. So I'm going to go ahead and just define this class in the interpreter itself, but I'll be using import later on. So here I've defined the class character with the code that we specified for it. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab our other characters and paste them in here so that I can make different instances of the class. So here I just did character 1 and I passed in Batman, and so I can even do a type and take a look, and you can see it's telling me that it is a type class. And then that underscore main, which references the init function, but that's a little above the scope of what we're talking about right now. And then dot character, which is the name of the class. So I can even access different attributes of the class directly now by referencing the self dot attribute. So we've passed in, Bruce Wayne, Batman, hero, master detective into name, alias, role, and abilities. And then the self is referencing this character 1 right here. So self up in the class is referencing that character 1, which is a character class with the attributes that we passed into it. So I'm going to go ahead and just call character1.name, and there you can see we get back Bruce Wayne. And I'll do character.role, and it tells me it's a hero. So we're accessing, we've created that object, character 1, with these different class attributes, and now we can access those attributes directly. So I'll go ahead and just punch in a couple more characters here so that we can see that we've made now 3 more objects, 3 more instances of the class, but I can still access each one of those objects just by punching in, the self name dot the attribute. And there you can see we get unknown for name on 4 because that's Bane, and we're getting character 3's alias, which is Joker. So I'll even do character 2, role, and we can see that Robin is a hero. Okay, awesome. And now we're going to start to look into these things called methods. And what methods are is they're just functions that we define inside of the class. So a class is meant to describe an object, which an object represents a real world thing. And so what these methods do is they need to relate to the object, but we realistically just define them the same way that we do any other function. So I've got this models.py file, and if you'll remember when we were covering some importing, that when I start Python interpreter, it's going to initialize and see everything that is in the same directory as where I either initialize that interpreter or where I'm running the script or the program from. So here I've got this models.py module, the models module, and I've got different classes defined in here. Realistically, we're just building off of that character class. I had to add something because we cannot have the same name for the class, and so I had to add things like, underscore method so that it's at least a little bit descriptive on what the difference is when you actually compare it to the parent class. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these methods right here that we're adding to our character class. And realistically, all I'm doing is, some quick little methods to get the name, get the ability, role, alias, and then I've started to also define out some things like having them fight and get their ability. This is a little bit, this one's not as updated because you can see up there it says class character, but realistically this is our character method. I'm looking at it on GitHub, which it's apparently not updated on there yet. But there you can see I'm just inside of the class defining each method as its own function, passing in the argument self, which is going to represent that object, and then it's going to do something based on, the different attributes or whatever the function is that it's actually written for. So for most of these, I'm just having it, return something about the character. So like get roles, get ability. But I am using that return statement to return that value back. So here you can see, I'm doing a return alias. And then at the bottom here, I will be doing some stuff where we're, trying to get that object to be doing something that represents in the real world. And so I'm going to be using the import statements from here on, and we'll actually be importing the module and then importing the class exactly from the module. But that self is still representing whatever we call it, and there you can see I'm going to having one of them fight, and then grabbing just printing a simple statement like self alias and what their actual ability is. And for those methods, you'll see I'm saying use ability and have them fight, so it's something that the object can do. So I'm going to be doing a from models, referencing the models module that we're in, and then I'll be importing character methods, which is the name of our class. It's just incorrect in this screenshot right here, but you saw in the models method that it is correct in there. And then we're going to be creating a few different instances of that class, and we'll be executing the methods within the class. So let's go back over here to the Python interpreter. Clear my screen. Okay. Now I'm going to get into the Python interpreter, and I'm going to import from the models, which you can see from the output of the list command, models.py, so it sees that module because it's in the same directory. It's initialized here. So if I go back into the Python interpreter, I'm going to do from models, import, and then the name of our class. Oh, I just pasted wrong. So let me go back over here, quit out, clear my screen real quick just to give us a fresh start. And I'll probably just go ahead and paste this directly so I don't have another problem. All right, there we go. So from models, import character methods. And then, oh, I'm getting an error. I need to stop on this one real quick while I troubleshoot that because that's an indentation error, so I might have to fix it. All right, sorry about that. That was an indentation error on another example. So we're going to come back into the Python interpreter here, and we're going to do a from models import and then the name of our class. And then once we actually do the from models import, and then there you can see we're going with character methods. We're going to go ahead and create a few instances of this class, and then we're going to call the methods that are in the class. So here we're just going to punch in, creating our Batman and Robin, Joker, and Bane characters, which are all instances of the character method. So I can now call that function just by calling self dot, and just as you can see we are calling the attributes again, I will just do a character methods dot the name of the function and then pass in self. So here you can see we got Batman is using their ability Master Detective, which referenced our character 1 object that we initialized earlier. And you'll notice I had to do the entire thing, that character methods. And that's because I did from models. So if I had models there, I would actually have to put models.charactermethods.usability character1. But because I'm using that from models import character methods, I have to actually define out the entire character methods before I actually call the function, and then pass in the object that we want to run against that function. But this is where a good case of, using something like an alias would come into play, because then I can do a from models import character methods as something shorter, then we do not have to enter in the entire name of that class. So here I'm going to go ahead and show that as an example, and I'm going to do it as a uppercase CM for character methods, and it cannot import from models. Oh, it would probably help if I spelled it right. Right, and there we go. Okay, so from models, import character methods as CM. So now I'm going to do CM, which is the alias for our character models, dot the name of the function, and pass in our character 3. Here I'm experiencing an error, but that's because I needed it to be uppercase. So there you go. I've got cm.fight character 3, and it produces back that our character Joker is fighting by referencing the alias instead of the actual entire class name. So just a very good use case for aliases. So I'll go ahead and quit out of here. Okay, so now we're going to look at inheritance, where we're actually creating a class, but we're just going to inherit all the attributes of the parent class that's above it. So we're going to come down here into our character inherit class, and you can see at the bottom that I've defined 2 more classes, one of which is hero and one of which is villain. So if I zoom in here, you can see I'm still using our original character class and inherit, but I've created these new classes, hero and villain. So it's going to inherit all of the attributes and methods that are in the parent class above it. So there's my hero class, where I'm passing in now character inherit, which is the parent class above it. And I'm doing the same down here for the villain character, passing in the character inherit class, which is going to make that the parent class. And you could continue going through these. You know, I could do villain as a child class of hero, which is then referencing the character inherit class. So it's this really big inception where we can just keep going with it. So I'm going to come back over here to the Python interpreter. I'm going to enter Python 3. Okay. I'm going to do from models, and then I'm going to import just the names of our child classes, which are hero and villain. And there you can see it accepted the import, no problem. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and define out our objects again, our character objects, but now I'm going to split them up between heroes and villains, which we will also see later how we can kind of make some changes to them. But here you can see throwing in character 1 and 2, which is Batman and Robin as heroes, and then the Joker and Bane as the villains. So I can still do character 4.alias, and I can see Bane, character 2.name, and I can see there's Robin's name. And I'm able to access those objects. Now what we can do as well is we can then start to actually alter these to where they are doing something different. Because right now what I've done is I've basically created exact replicas of our character class. So even coming back over here, you can see I haven't done anything with them. But down here, what we are going to do is we're going to do the same thing, only this time we are going to define some methods that only apply to heroes and some methods that would only apply to villains. So as I get in here, you can see I'm inheriting still the character class that's above it. I'm defining hero and a character inherit method, which is going to be the new class that it's inheriting from, and I've defined a couple of different methods in there that only apply to the hero or the villain. So I've stop crime, and then I've got fight villain, and there on the second one, what we're going to be doing is actually passing in 2 arguments into that method, one of which is has to be self because it's an argument of the object. And then we're also going to be throwing in this villain.alias and see what that actually spits out if we toss in a different object. All right, so let's come back over to Secure CRT, get into the Python interpreter real quick. And from models, my module, I'm going to import my, and actually I noticed right here that that I had a problem, and that is that I am going to import hero and villain, but they're defined twice. Basically, they overwrote each other. So if I come back out and I actually take a look at the repository, we can see in here that I've got the class hero and villain defined twice. So when I imported it the first time, I thought I was importing this one that didn't have any methods in it. But because when I did that from models and initialized, the entire module, it ran through that entire line of code. So I actually imported the ones with methods in it because they ended up overriding the ones that I had declared first. So I declared those first, but then when I declared them again, those took priority, and those are the ones with the methods. So although I didn't call those methods, I still could have used them if I wanted to. So from models, I'm still going to do the import hero and villain. And then I'm going to start copy from my text editor over here. I'm going to go ahead and create our objects, different heroes and villains. So you can see there, creating Batman, Robin, Joker, and Bane. And now I'm going to actually check out to see if those methods that I created, if I can call methods that only pertain to that class. So I'm going to do hero dot hero change. Actually, I got to fix that real quick, so I did a bad copy paste. There we go, hero and hero character fight, and I'm going to pass in character 2. Robin is fighting, which referenced that method, and then we passed in our character 2 object. So that's what I mean by the ones down here overwrite the ones that we did beforehand. So I can even do hero, stop crime, and there you can see does not have stop crime, but it would probably help if I spelled it right, add that E in there, and there I can see Robin has just stopped a crime. So I used another method from within that child class, and it's only specific to the hero class. So I've got another one here where I can pass in 2, and I'm going to pass in, although I'm referencing the hero.fightVillain method, I'm passing in character 1 and character 4, and there you can really see where object-oriented programming kind of shines for us, because in that method I only referenced the villain.alias, but it was able to pick that up by passing in the character 4 object. And realistically, I think that about does it for this. Just so we don't leave villains out, I'm going to go ahead and rob a bank here. So I'll do villain.robbank, and I'll pass in character 3. Joker has just robbed a bank. So you can see, I'm even using a method that is directly related to that child class as well. But that's realistically wrapping up object-oriented programming. So you can see it has a lot to do with these classes. And then initializing the classes, creating different instances of the class, and all a method is a function that we define within the class. Every instance of the class is then its own object. And we can use those objects throughout our program. So I hope you all enjoyed this lecture, and I hope you enjoy the labs on functions, classes, and methods. All right, so in summary, we've gone over defining functions, the different argument types and how we can pass those arguments into our functions, the difference between global and local variables, how we have to use that return statement in order to access any type of return value as a result of that function. We've covered different classes and the class methods. We've covered a little bit about, creating some child classes, and we've gotten into Batman and creating our characters in Batman, as well as creating some different methods for those classes. We've covered object-oriented programming, what it is, and I hope you now have a better understanding of what it means to be an object in object-oriented programming and how that really that's really some of those core elements or core theories is those classes, the class methods that are used to describe those objects or interact with those objects. We've gone over class and instance variables, how each instance of that class can have its own variables. And then we've covered class inheritance, and finally we went into a demo of functions, classes, methods, object-oriented programming, importing from modules, and the use of aliases. All right, so if there's any questions, I do recommend and ask that you direct them, please, towards the discussion board. Chances are if you have that question, somebody else also in the class has that question, and it just helps to start to debate amongst your peers. It's something that's very important that you learn how to do once you get into the real world, is debate, and debate healthfully about good ways to do things, better ways of doing things, and just that's how you come up with the best solution for everything. So with that, I will leave you to the labs. I hope you enjoy the labs for this week. And next week, we will be diving in a little bit further with Python and working with different data in Python, as well as some of the modules that are pre-built and ready for networking and software-defined networking. So I hope you enjoy this week's labs. Thank you.